This is TLV1.
TLV1 radio.
Great mixture.
I like Tel Aviv.
This is still V1.
This is
Tel Aviv is a beautiful city.
Great city, great radio.
TLV1.
This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I am your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers, researchers, documentary filmmakers and other people of all trades and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. And on our show today, our first guest will be Dr. Jonathan Rubin, a historian of the Medieval Levant at Tel Aviv University, who specializes in the production of knowledge in the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem in the 12th and 13th centuries. He will tell us about how the Crusaders' encounter with local societies, beyond the initial indignation, led to theological, economic and scientific developments. Our second guest will be Dr. Danna Piroyansky, also a historian, whose new book, Ramle Remade, the Israelization of an Arab Town 1948 to 1967, has just been published in English. She will tell us about the very Israeli concept of mixed cities, the result of government-sanctioned mixing of Jewish and Arab populations, and how it came about in Ramle, a town in the southeastern coastal plain that was Arab-Palestinian up until the 1948 War of Independence and was consequently populated with Jewish immigrants. Needless to say, it was not trouble-free. This is our show today. Do stay with us. We'll be back right after this musical break. You're listening to the Tel Aviv Review here on TLV1. I am Gilad Halpern. Welcome back. I'm joined here in the studio by Dr. Jonathan Rubin. He's a historian of the Medieval Levant, or the Holy Land, at the Tel Aviv University. He specializes in the production of knowledge in the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem in the 12th and 13th centuries. Hello, Yoni, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, Gilad, thank you.
So in your research, you focus on revisiting a common assumption in your field, and that is that the production of knowledge in this region was relatively inferior to the other frontiers of Christendom at the time, namely Sicily and the Iberian Peninsula, where European Christians came in contact with other churches and other religions altogether. So I'd like to start here and say that it seems to me completely counterintuitive. It's not the fact that Jerusalem yielded less knowledge than other places, but rather the fact that there was any kind of contact or interaction or intellectual crossover at all there in other places, because, to my mind at least, the Crusaders didn't come to integrate and learn and be inspired, but rather to impose themselves and their views.
Okay, yeah. So this is really a place where we see a great gap between what historians know and what more general audiences know, because as far as historians are concerned, we know for a long time that one of the major trends in the 12th century in the intellectual history is really a process in which, when the Latins met Islam, especially in Iberia, one of the things they were concerned with is a great project of translation of Arabic works into Latin. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the Muslim world had Aristotle and had many scientific works translated from Greek around 800. Okay, so they had this kind of stuff for centuries. The Westerners, when they came into contact with the Muslims, again, especially in Iberia and to a lesser extent in Sicily, they learned that the Muslim world has a lot to offer in terms of philosophy, in terms of mathematics, in terms of astrology, which was a sort of scientific field. And they started translating works.
But how did it square with the very fundamental belief that the Islamic world is the center of heresy? Because, the religion was the benchmark at the time. So how could those Western Christians in the Middle Ages, could see the Muslims as, on the one hand, completely heretical, and on the other hand, holding some sort of truth and knowledge?
Well, the Latins actually deal with this point, and they try to make a distinction. Okay, so for example, one thing would be the argument that you sometimes find in texts that the Muslim scholars don't really believe Islam. They sort of play it out, but they don't actually believe it. They're much too clever to believe it. So you find these kinds of things in texts. But in any case, the Latins, or it's not the Latins, but there were enough Latins who were very interested in discovering Muslim knowledge and taking it into the Latin world. Perhaps the most important is Gerard of Cremona. It's an Italian guy. And he's very interested in the work by Ptolemy from the ancient world. Okay, so a Greek work in astronomy, and he hears in Cremona in Italy. He hears that he can find this work in Toledo. So he goes to Toledo, and there he translates it, or is helped by people probably, but he translates it from Arabic into Latin. And then he discovers that, except Talmai, they have a tremendous number of important works in Arabic in Toledo. So he...
that was in the 9th century or thereabouts?
No, in the 12th century.
In 12th
so this is a part
right.
of the trend I'm talking about. So what he does is actually move his life over there, and he spends all his life translating works from Arabic into Latin. And these texts will have a major effect. In medicine, the things that he translated would dominate university education till the 17th century. So you see, for historians, it's quite clear that one of the major trends in the European intellectual history is that in the 12th and 13th centuries, there's a massive process of translation of works from Arabic into Latin, and that actually transformed the whole European intellectual world. The entrance of Aristotle, the Aristotelian corpus, into Europe had major effects on this cultural world, again, for centuries.
Did it do anything to rattle the foundations of Christian belief, the canonic Christian belief? Can we see this as a precursor to the Protestant faith and other contrarian currents within Christendom?
Well, I would put it differently. What we see is a challenge to Christianity and to Catholicism, and there was definitely a challenge. So the works of Aristotle get into the Latin world, and then it's sort of, what are we doing with this? One of the major problems with Aristotle is that he did not believe that the world was created. He thought that the world was eternal. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now you this is a problem. I mean, so the Latin theologians admire Aristotle greatly, but then they have a problem with this question. And by the way, Maimonides had exactly the same problem. When he writes in his Guide of the Perplexed, he engages with this exact problem. Okay, so both Judaism and Christianity had to cope with the introduction of Aristotle. Okay, so yeah, this was definitely a challenge. They couldn't ignore it, but they had to do a lot of work in order to adapt it into either Judaism and Christianity.
So let's shift the focus to our part of the world, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Why did historians think that the production of knowledge here was inferior, and why do you think they were wrong?
Okay, so firstly, they were not completely wrong, and I'll say in a minute why. But the reason that they thought that very little information was transferred from the Muslim or Arabic world into the Latin world is that, as I said, in Toledo we have dozens of translations from Arabic into Latin. And when you look at what happened in our part of the world, there's hardly any. Okay, so they looked at it, we can say, in a rather formal way, and they said, okay, here we have a giant corpus of translations, here we hardly have any. So that probably means that nothing was going on. They were also, I think, led to think this way by the fact that in this part of the world there was a lot of fighting going on. A lot of it was religion motivated, let's say. So
and also Spain was a cultural and intellectual hub, whereas in Jerusalem wasn't quite on the same level.
Yes, absolutely. So that, actually, I see that as one of the explanations of the difference between what happened there and what happened here. But usually what you find in books is that people here were interested in either fighting a religious war, or when they were not doing that, they were busy making money. Okay, like the Venetians, or people like that, who were merchants, who were motivated by making money. Yeah. Okay, so usually the argument that you find is that you didn't have here the kind of people who would have been interested in accumulating knowledge from the Arabic world.
Well, did it have a lot to offer in terms of knowledge?
So exactly, this is one of the questions, and I think that actually one of the explanations for the fact that what was happening here was rather limited is not what you find often in books, that so the Crusaders were not receptive. Okay, that's a thing that you find in books. I don't think they were not receptive. I think that when they conquered the Holy Land, actually the Holy Land had less books to offer than Toledo, for example. Toledo, Muslim Toledo, okay, till it was conquered by the Latins, was a main intellectual center. Jerusalem was not an intellectual center in the centuries before 1099, the conquest by the First Crusade, and the intellectuals who did live in it and did write books were people who were concerned with Islam, okay, with Quranic exegeses, with Muslim law, okay? But you didn't have mathematicians working here. You didn't have important physicians working here, okay? So when they came, they simply found a very limited corpus of books. So I think that's actually one of the keys to this very crucial difference between the regions.
Can you draw the line and really distinguish between theological polemic, those religious Christians who came here to polemicize with Islam, and other perhaps more mundane sort of knowledge? You mentioned medicine and science and maths and other fields.
Yeah, so I think as far as the activity in the Latin Kingdom, the intellectual activity or the fields that interested people, you can put on the one hand interest in religion, okay, which would be divided really into interest in Islam, and not less importantly, but quite neglected, interest in the whole group of groups of Oriental Christians, which the Latins met here for the first time. Okay, so when a Latin bishop comes here, he has a chance to meet Armenians, he has a chance to meet Copts, Ethiopians, okay, Maronite, a whole range of Christian...
What was their attitude towards them? I mean, they weren't quite heretical as the Muslims, but I mean, it was kind of a... They were in limbo, no pun intended.
Yeah, well, it's really problematic. It's a very complex question. It also depends on the groups. Generally, we can say that the Latins were rather hostile towards the Greek Orthodox, which were the main group and which were strongly related, of course, to the Byzantine Empire. So they were rather hostile toward them. They were more friendly to smaller groups like the Jacobites, like the Copts.
Because they were less threatened by them politically?
Yes, I think that basically, yes. Because actually, theologically, theoretically, they were supposed to be closer to the Greek Orthodox because they're not monophysites, whereas the Copts are. So it's it's a more political.
Right.
It's the reason is more political than theological. So, but yeah, the relation was quite complex. On the one hand, these are not Muslims. On the other hand, they did not benefit from the same, let's say, the legal status of Latins. So what you had is actually formally in the Latin Kingdom, there was the status of the Latins, and the second status was a common one to Jews, Muslims, and Oriental Christians.
Right.
So that's sort of surprising, I think, that the Oriental Christians were in the same legal status as Muslims and Jews, at least formally.
And theologically, what does this sort of dialogue with the Eastern churches produce? Did it enrich the Latins in any way? Yeah,
so that's one of the main things I've been working on. And yes, I think that one of the let's say, the main focuses or main aspects of intellectual activity in the Latin East was actually a process of members of clergy, Latin members of clergy coming here, being very interested in these groups and trying to talk with them and learn from them, sometimes in a more friendly manner, and sometimes, in particular, in later decades, toward the end of the 13th century, in a more hostile manner. But definitely, I think there was a process of learning about these groups.
Can you give an example?
Jacques de Vitry, who was the Bishop of Acre around 1220, was a very well-educated member of clergy. He eventually became a cardinal, so this is a very important figure in the church. And he came here, and you see both in a letter that he wrote to friends of his in Paris and in a book that he wrote, at least much of while in Acre, or planned at least parts of it in Acre, you see his interest in these groups. And he says, I asked a Coptic guy about this, and he told me that and that. So you see that he's accumulating knowledge. And what's very significant here, I think, is that this information, this letter, was sent to Paris to very well-educated people. So for me, this is an indication that this knowledge was not well known in the West. Otherwise, he would not have needed to send it to friends of his. And these friends, again, are people with very well trained in theology. So he must have been collecting here information which was unavailable yet in the West. So yes, I think that in this field, at least, there was some significant contribution to the, let's say, the Western body of knowledge.
Very interesting. Now, I'd like to move to the more practical aspect of this intellectual crossover and focus on medicine, because in medicine there was a common interest, perhaps a pragmatic interest, to better the lives of people per se, regardless of their religion. The polemical element of the theological crossover was absent.
Yes, absolutely. So I think medicine, and that's something that I've been working on for last year or two. I think that medicine is a good field in which to check these kind of crossovers, exactly because of what you say. It's a pragmatic field, but also because it's geographically specific. And I'll say what I mean. One of the fields, or the field I've been focusing on, is what we call materia medica. We're talking about the substances which were used for medicine. It could be plants, it could be minerals, and it could be parts of animals. Now, this is at least partly geographically specific, because when the Crusaders come here, they obviously meet, or they see for the first time, plants that they didn't see elsewhere, animals that they didn't see earlier. And that's the reason I think that they would have wanted to learn from local practitioners about these substances. Mm-hmm. It's also, medicine is also specifically geographical from another point of view. Some of the diseases which the Crusaders suffered from here were specific, to warmer areas. Yeah. So you have both new medical problems and potential for new medical solutions. And another point is that materia medica are also things that have an economic potential. Okay, yeah. Some of them are very expensive. Okay, and we know that, for example, in the port of Acre, medical substances would have been traded on the way to the West. Right. Okay, so when you trade something, you want to be able to say, this is good for this kind of disease, and this is very good for that kind of, of medical problems. Yeah. So you would have learned a lot.
Was there any kind of medical treatment that was born here and transformed any type of medicine in the West?
Yeah. So. One thing I wrote about is about the history of the Theriac. Now, the Theriac is a very old remedy. It appears already in Greek and Roman medicine. But what happened here is that when the Latins came here, they saw for the first time that the Arab practitioners, in order to prepare the Theriac, are using a specific snake from the Dead Sea region. Okay, so then we can follow a process by which the Latins adopt this practice of using this particular snake from the Dead Sea area for the production of the Theriac. And we can also follow this in medical texts and medical encyclopedias or encyclopedias in the West, because you see that this snake starts to appear in such texts really during the period we're talking about. And there's really a development of an understanding that you can't make the Theriac without this poor snake from the Dead Sea region. Okay, so this is a very specific element which I've been able to trace down. Now, it might look like a very marginal thing, but first of all, it's indicative, I think, because you can follow the whole process of, Arab big practitioners having a certain local practice, Latins coming and picking it up. That process being transferred to the most important centers of medicine in the West, and when you follow this, you also see that this had a great economic potential, because these snakes seem to have been very, very expensive, to the extent that one of our texts says that the Mamluk Sultan prohibits its trade because he doesn't want it to become extinct. I mean, he wants to have this important resource continually in his territories. Okay, so I think this is a little story, but it is quite, I think, a significant indication of something going on.
Mm-hmm. How fascinating. But I'm afraid we're out of time. Dr. Jonathan Rubin, historian of the Medieval Levant, or the Holy Land, at Tel Aviv University. Thank you very much for coming in. It was really interesting.
Thank you, Gilad.
searching for a heart of gold, and I'm getting old. Keeps me searching for a heart of gold, and I'm getting old. Keep me searching for a heart of gold. You keep me searching and I'm growing old. Keep me searching for a heart of gold. I've been a miner for a heart of gold.
You're listening to the Tel Aviv Review here on TLV1. I am Gilad Halpern. Welcome back. I'm now joined here in the studio by Dr. Danna Piroyansky. She's a historian and author of Ramle Remade, the Israelization of an Arab Town, 1948 to 1967. Was recently published in English by Pardes. Now, up until Israel's War of Independence, Ramle was a Palestinian city in the southeastern coastal plain, not far from where Ben Gurion Airport is today, about 25 kilometers southeast of Tel Aviv. It was conquered by Israeli forces in July 1948 and soon thereafter was inhabited by newly arrived Jewish immigrants and gradually turned into one of Israel's mixed cities, in inverted commas, and we're here to talk precisely about that process. Hello, Danna, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, thank you.
So, Ramle isn't Israel's only mixed city. What can you tell us about that category, about the policies, the politics that made it become one?
I think to begin with, the inverted commas that you mentioned just now is a right way of looking at it, because it's such a complex and pregnant with meaning term that it needs to be analyzed very carefully. The concept of being a mixed town or a mixed city, a term that we don't really see when we discuss other such similar towns and cities throughout the world, is indeed very complex, because it can reflect various degrees of a divide or a shared space or a polarized space even. I mean, it really depends on how you feel that picture. Mm-hmm. In the case of Ramle, as you said, it's a city that was Palestinian, was Arab before 1948, unlike some of the other towns and cities in Israel. For example, Haifa, that was its socio-demographic mixture was indeed more versatile than Ramle's.
And it
or
preceded 1948 as well.
Exactly, exactly because of that. And so when we discuss Israeli mixed cities, we must begin first of all with a term of mixed city, and really, I'm not sure, it has been criticized a lot in researches
But I want to perhaps enter the mind of the leadership of Young Israel in 1948. Mm-hmm. What were they thinking? What was their ultimate goal by deciding that Ramle and the other mixed cities would become that?
Mm-hmm. First of all, it was a town, I think, as they saw it, just waiting for someone to come and take over. A lot of most of the original population escaped or was expelled or both, and so the Jewish Israeli authorities saw empty houses for a lot of immigrants that were coming in, and actually an opportunity to.
But there are other examples. Mm-hmm. For example, Tiberias, which was also 100% Palestinian and was emptied. I'm using a neutral term here.
Very neutral.
as much as I can, and then became 100% Jewish after 1948, and the case of Nazareth, for example, that saw the construction of a nearby sister city that was Jewish. So the concept of mixture wasn't applied throughout the country.
I don't think there was necessarily a master plan here in the sense of a plan that needs to be implemented throughout the country. I think that a lot of decisions were taken ad hoc and dependent on what happened, what really was on ground. And Ramle, because of its centrality, for example, because of its location, and because of the fact that Palestinian, Arab, some of the Arab population either stayed or returned. All these were factors that needed to be taken into account when decisions were made. And not all the time decisions were actually made. Sometimes, and we see it very, very clearly in Ramle, things happen, just because they happen, just because certain individuals came and decided that something will either happen or not happen. And so we have a lot of interesting examples with the squatters, for example, that come, individual people who want to find a place, and they're not being given a house, an abandoned house in inverted commas, and they take it, they take the matters to their own hands and decide. So it's the idea of a minutely planned program, or some mega idea is not. I don't think it's always valid. I think things were decided on the ground.
So let's focus on the micro history, as it were. Who were those people who arrived in Ramle in 1948, and what did they see, and what was what were the practices of redefining the community?
In November 1948, the first group of Jewish immigrants who arrived were immigrants from Bulgaria, and they were referred to Ramle. What they saw when they arrived there, was a town that its architecture was Middle Eastern, Arab, whose very few Arab residents were concentrated in a relatively small physical area, which was named Sakne, the neighborhood, or was referred to and is referred to this day as the ghetto. And as part of the military administration in town, which prevailed for a year since its conquest, the Arab population was concentrated there, and so a lot of houses were available, so to speak, to these new immigrants.
In parentheses, those Arabs who stayed, why did they stay, whereas the others left?
We know that a lot of those who left either before the air bombarding that Ramle experienced in July, and or immediately thereafter, and
by the Israeli Air Force.
Yeah, of course. And those who were living in the Sakne at that period, the end of the second half of 1948 and to 1949, were either those who stayed because they were either ill, or women stayed, or returned back to town. And it's interesting because, as opposed to the demographic majority that existed in town prior to 1948, prior to the conquest, which was majorly Muslim, the remaining families were mostly of Christian denomination. Right. And so the city changed, not only in the Jewish Arab aspect, but also in the Arab demographics as well.
Okay, let's go back to the Jews who arrived in November 1948.
They came with their suitcases, I would imagine, and they found something that was quite chaotic. They were apparently, some of them were given houses, some were just told to go and choose, and they did. We know that some of the people who arrived there were, and that looked around them were uncomfortable by the sight they encountered, and I refer, of course, to the Sakne, to the ghetto, which was fenced. And so communication between Arabs and Jews was minimal at the time. A military administration existed. And despite the military administration, there was some, I think, some, chaos in the air, or a feeling that things were kind of still shifting and nothing was final. And so what you did, what happened depended on your initiative, on your luck, on the sort of agency that helped you find your place. Was it the Jewish agency or the military? Or
what's interesting about it is that it was a melting pot in the most perhaps essential sense of the term, because it wasn't one community or society that was imposing itself on the other. There were both people who underwent some sort of new socialization process. Either there were the Arab Palestinians who had to face the new context of an Israeli state, or immigrants who also knew relatively nothing about the new homeland.
Mm-hmm. It's true, although I'm not sure that their positions are really comparable, in the sense that some stayed and other stayed and experienced very different circumstances than what they used to, materially and socially, politically, of course, whereas others, despite the difficulties, were given new opportunities, and they had their difficulties, obviously, but it wasn't the same on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
In Ramle, I think that things were much more complicated on ground, because when you discussed Jews, it was initially Bulgarian new immigrants, but there were also military men who were there and were more veteran Israelis as far as this went, and later immigrants from Iraq, and the picture gets more and more complicated as you go. It still gets complicated to this day. I mean, more and more ethnical groups are being thrown into this melting pot. And it's the same with the Arab population. I mean, we discussed the fact that initially those who stayed in town, but later on there were returnees. There were Arab villagers from the nearby villages who immigrated to Ramle and joined in. And so also on the Arab side, the demographic pictures kept changing and being more and more diverse. So putting it in terms of two sides, I think, simplifies the.
Mm-hmm. So that brings me to my next question, because unlike your predecessors who studied this question, you use the term Israelization rather than Judaization of the city. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate on this a bit?
I don't know. I've read obviously a lot of books that use the term of Judaization. I've always found it, I don't know, if intuitively perhaps, a bit restricted. I think that the idea of Israelization can contain the idea of Judaization of the space, but it also allows us to throw in Zionist and Hebrew as a language, and these ideas are something that are more. They're more open-ended, or the term Israelization, as I would like to use it, is kind of an umbrella term for many things besides the question of faith or that aspect of identity. This is not to say, of course, that Israelization at that time, or perhaps even now, was something that is closed or well-defined. Or the truth is, it was none of those, and it has been, and it still is, an open-ended process. And
what can you tell us about this process, both at the symbolic and the tangible level?
Well, in the book, I discuss several aspects of this process. it's interesting because I found that they have kind of a spatial resonance and chronological one as well. And so we can see at the very early stage of Israelizing Ramle, kind of appropriation of little things, houses.
Like the name, calling it Ramla as opposed to Ramle.
Exactly. That's one of them. That's a symbolic one. But I mean, there aren't only symbolic such as that. The name issue is very interesting because whereas before 1948, Ramla, it was, it can be it can sound close enough. It's very interesting because after the Israelization of town, or throughout its Israelization, there was a very clear intent of it sounding Israeli, Ramla, with the right syllable being emphasized. And so we see it in municipal leaflets and in maps, and it's very, as far as we can read it, it's very, it's there.
Mm-hmm. So that's just one example. What
That's
about
one example, yeah.
perhaps more, geographical ones? Or what was something that has to do with the space, or with the urban space of the city?
There are various layers of that spatial conquest or spatial appropriation of town. Some of these are has to do with most of them actually with daily lives and the experiences of people living there. Processes I found processions that march through town at various periods.
To do what?
Different things. For example, in 1954, the military procession, the annual, very significant military procession of Israel, went through Ramle, and with it all its meanings and layers of intention and symbolic acts of appropriation. Another layer is that of the neighborhoods who existed in Ramle and either changed their look or were created in the first place. The new housing projects that were built in Ramle in the end of the 1960s.
Was there any attempt to integrate the indigenous Arab population into this process?
It's an interesting question. First of all, there are a few pockets, so to speak, of residency in Ramle. One is the Sakne, or the ghetto, in which as I said, the Arab residents were concentrated to begin with.
Calling it a ghetto speaks volume, because ghetto means separate, means surrounded by a fence.
Yeah. And so initially it was indeed surrounded by barbed wire fence, as in other towns, by the way.
Interesting.
At that period, of course. But gradually, of course, these fences were taken down, but the conceptual segregation or exclusion was taken further. We see that whereas the old center of town, the Sakne, and where the market is to this day, was left to slowly deteriorate, and its appearance to this day is not. Let's say they don't put a lot of money there. The municipality chooses to refrain from that. From the 1960s towards, we see a westward kind of a movement of new buildings, new neighborhoods, and the people. It's interesting because the people who live there are usually Jews, but some. Kind of Jews, not all Jews. A lot of Jews from a Mizrahi origin remain to live in the Sakne. Slowly entered the Sakne and remain to live there. Whereas Ashkenazi Jews either left town completely or went to live, were able to buy
because they're in a higher social class.
Yes, indeed. And it's interesting because that higher social class was something that was achieved in these years. It wasn't something inherent necessarily, but power relations in town were built and changed exactly during these years.
Right. I will have to ask you one last question because we're quickly running out of time. Why Ramle? Why did you choose Ramle out of, the entire state of Israel?
Well, first of all, this book and the research project was part of an international project that involved Israeli and German researchers, and was meant to discuss questions of appropriation and immigration in post-war areas, and it was, the project discussed Israel / Palestine, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. And my part in the project was to write a monograph, which I eventually did, on an Israeli case study. And so there was a certain pool of options. Ramle was very attractive because no one wrote on it in the last 50 years or so.
Wow.
The previous book on Ramle was an invited, kind of municipally invited historical overview that was written in 1961, if I'm correct, by Ze'ev Vilnai. And in that sense, the urge to
not a
dig
very
into,
critical, I'm assuming.
You assume correctly, but you're more than welcome to read it. Of course, it's fascinating. So digging into undug material was very appealing. My family, interestingly enough, when my grandparents came from Argentina to Israel, they were referred to live in Ramle. They didn't stay there for very long, but nevertheless, we have some kind of family affinity to the place.
You're a local patriot. Dr. Danna Piroyansky, a historian and writer of Ramle Remade, the Israelization of an Arab Town, 1948 to 1967, that was recently published in English by Pardes Publishing. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And now we've reached the end of our show for this week. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to the technical producers of this show, Leo Peleg, Adam Scher, and Sagi Gorali Ventura. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. Until then, do not forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And do not hesitate to get in touch, Gilad Jayaledi at tlv1.fm with your comments and suggestions. Thank you very much. I hope to be joined by you again next week. And until then, goodbye.
I wonder how many times you've been had, and I wonder how many plans have gone bad. I wonder how many times you had sex, and I wonder, do you know who'll be next? I wonder. Wonder I do. I wonder about the love you can't find, and I wonder about the loneliness that's mine. I wonder how much going have you got, and I wonder about your friends that are not. I wonder. Wonder I do. I wonder about the tears in children's eyes, and I wonder about the soldier that dies. I wonder, will this hatred ever end? I wonder, and worry my friend. Wonder, don't you? I wonder how many times you've been had, and I wonder how many dreams